The International Criminal Court issues an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin over war crimes against Ukraine.
Today, the International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights, for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation.
We will be speaking to a former chief prosecutor to the United Nations International Criminal Tribunals, and we'll be asking what this all means in practice. Also on the programme, we're going to have the latest on the strikes. Is the government's willingness to move on pay a solution or a risky precedent? The SNP leadership contenders turn inwards as new figures show the party has shed 30,000 members in 2 years.
Candidates have gone on to trash our government's record and call it mediocre when it's far from that. So gifting the opposition ammunition isn't going to help the SNP, and that's why I've avoided making those personal attacks.
PM speaks to frontrunner Hamza Yousaf on continuity, independence and infighting. And
these women were saying to me, we want to be able to buy sexy underwear. We don't want to wear all that harsh lace stuff. We want to buy nice sexy underwear that makes us feel good about ourselves.
Jacqueline Gold, the boss of Ann Summers, has died at the age of 62. Kirsty Walk tells us what it was like to share a house with the entrepreneur who brought sex to the high street. We're going to start, though, with the BBC News, read today by Chris Aldridge.
The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for President Putin, accusing him of war crimes in Ukraine. The warrant alleges that he's responsible for the unlawful deportation of children to Russia. Ukraine has called the move historic. The Kremlin has described the warrant as outrageous and said Russia did not recognise the Dutch-based court. Here's our security correspondent, Frank Gardner.
This, on the face of it, is an extraordinary development in Russia's year-old invasion of Ukraine. Of all the many alleged and well-documented war crimes committed there by Russian forces, the ICC has chosen to focus on the apparent forced abduction of Ukrainian children to Russia. And, in the eyes of the court, the blame rests squarely with President Putin and Russia's Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova. The arrest warrants are in response to the alleged war crime of unlawful transfer of children from Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. A statement issued by the ICC said the arrest warrants were intended to be secret in order to protect victims and witnesses, but it said it was in the interests of justice to publicize them in order to prevent any further abductions.
President Putin will welcome China's leader Xi Jinping to Russia next week for a state visit. Beijing and Moscow say the two men will discuss strategic cooperation and sign a number of important bilateral agreements without offering details. Beijing is promoting a plan that it says can bring a negotiated end to the war in Ukraine. The Home Office has said it's putting comprehensive plans in place as Passport Office staff across the UK prepare to begin a 5-week-long strike from early next month. More than 1,000 members of the Public and Commercial Services Union are due to walk out in a dispute about jobs, pay and conditions. It's thought the action could have a serious impact on people needing to renew their passports before the summer holidays. Mark Sawalka is the General Secretary of the PCS Union, which represents civil servants. He says many of his members rely on benefits and food banks because they're paid so little.
These people who will be going on strike, 40,000 of them are using food banks. 45,000 of them claim benefits off the government because their pay is so low. And in 2 government departments alone, 47,000 people are now on the national minimum wage. And we've given a dossier to the government of their own staff skipping meals, not putting the heating on, and they've been given 2%.
Education unions in England have started talks with the government after thousands of teachers agreed not to call any further strikes in the next 2 weeks. The negotiations involve 4 unions and are aimed at resolving a long-running dispute about pay and teachers' workloads. The talks are expected to continue over the weekend. A police constable has been told she'll keep her job despite being found guilty of gross misconduct for using excessive force on a former footballer who later died. A disciplinary panel heard that Mary Ellen Beckley-Smith repeatedly struck Dalian Atkinson, who played for Aston Villa, with her baton in 2016. Her colleague, PC Benjamin Monk, was subsequently jailed for manslaughter. Anita Sharma from the human rights charity Inquest has expressed surprise that PC Beckley-Smith was handed a final written warning rather than losing her job.
It's a disappointing and concerning decision. Her actions have been shown to be disproportionate, unlawful, excessive. And for members of the public to have confidence in the police force, it's important that there are strong sanctions. And if this officer is going to be able to keep operating as an officer, it does ring some alarm bells.
Researchers have said that the number of children developing a peanut allergy could be cut by 3/4 if babies are given small amounts of smooth peanut butter mixed with breast milk from 4 to 6 months old. This is earlier than recommended by current NHS guidance. The researchers say whole and chopped nuts are a choking risk and should never be given to babies. The favourite, Galopin des Champs, has won this year's Cheltenham Gold Cup. It was the third victory for the jockey Paul Townend and owner Willie Mullins in 5 years.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. As you've been hearing in the news, the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the head of the Russian Children's Commission. Now, this means that Mr. Putin could be detained if he leaves the country. The two are accused of committing war crimes by forcibly deporting children from Ukraine. Piotr Hofmansky is the president of the ICC.
Today, 17th of March 2023, the International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation for Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights, for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation. The ICC is doing its part of work. As a court of law, the judges issued arrest warrants. Their execution depends on international cooperation.
So that was Piotr Hofmansky, who's the president of the ICC. Lise Doucette is the BBC's chief international correspondent. And let's just start with real basics here, Lise. What is the ICC? What muscle does it have?
The International Criminal Court is a linchpin of the international human rights architecture, the drive to fight against impunity, particularly in times of war. Its mandate is to investigate, and if there is sufficient evidence, to try individuals charged with the gravest of crimes. There's 4 of them: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. It's governed by an international treaty called the Rome Statute, and only those countries which have ratified the statute are bound by it, and Russia has not ratified it. Only 121 states have. They don't include the United States, and for example, if you take the Middle East, only 1 Arab state ratified it. So it has great power, but it's also limited.
Okay, so I mean, if Russia hasn't ratified it, does Russia care?
Well, they've already dismissed it, saying it has no legal standing. They've called the charges outrageous, but I think it's an important part. It's one of the essential pillars of this war in Ukraine. Whenever the Ukrainians talk about the victory, they say that they can and will win. They don't just talk about taking the territory back that Russia has occupied or seized ever since 2014. They also talk about justice, putting President Putin on trial. And because there is this problem with the ICC, there has been talk for some time about setting up a separate court. But still, this does matter in the eyes of the world. If President Putin does travel to a country which is part of the ICC, he could be arrested. ICC prosecutor Karim Khan opened an investigation into possible war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide a year ago, and he's made 4 trips to Ukraine already, including one just a few weeks ago.
Lise, I mean, we're all familiar with Vladimir Putin's name, but what about this woman, this Commissioner for Children's Rights? What do we know about her?
It's quite interesting that they have chosen to start with this particular crime, because one of the weaknesses of many of these courts, and the ICC is a permanent court, but there have been temporary courts, for example, for the former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda. But one of the problems has been enough evidence to establish a chain of command. But the one that they have chosen, there is abundant evidence. The woman, the Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, has boasted about the fact that they have taken children from Ukraine. She herself said that she adopted a 15-year-old from Mariupol, and our listeners may remember how Mariupol on the Sea of Azov, on the Black Sea, was smashed to smithereens by the Russians in the early days of the war, and is now occupied by Russia. Many children were taken from there. She complained that the children had been indoctrinated by Ukraine, how they criticized the Russian president, and so she is very much seen as complicit. But it should be pointed out that the indictment also says that President Putin was also directly responsible, and that he did not use his presidential powers to stop the deportation of children.
Lise, thank you very much indeed. And Lise was mentioning both the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Justice Richard Goldstone is a former judge who was chief prosecutor of the United Nations International Criminal Tribunals for both of those places, for former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. And he joins us from South Africa. Thank you very much for sparing the time. I mean, just how significant do you think this is?
Well, it's highly significant. The first point I would make, it's very important for leaders who are suspected of committing serious war crimes to be held accountable. But the significance for President Putin is obviously the fact that there are 123 member states who have ratified the Rome Statute, and that means that each of those states is legally obliged under the Rome Statute and under international law to arrest President Putin if he comes within their jurisdiction. And it's very difficult, I would suggest, for a head of state, and especially for a permanent member of the Security Council, to do his work efficiently and appropriately if he is in fact an outlaw in the jurisdiction of 123 member states of the United Nations.
I mean, just with your former experience, I mean, what does it do to an individual when they see their name appear on that list, whatever their outward words may be? I mean, you dealt with people like Mladic and Karadzic. To have your name appear on this list, what does it actually do?
Well, as I say, it makes them outlaws. They adopted Milosevic and Karadzic and Bashir, for that matter, all adopted the same dismissive approach that has come out of Moscow today. But it really doesn't hold much water. It made their lives extremely difficult, and as I say, for a head of state to be under an international warrant of arrest has very serious consequences.
Yeah, are you surprised by the second warrant that's been issued to this Children's Commissioner?
No, not really, for the reason that has just been mentioned a few minutes ago on your programme. Apparently, she has been public in acknowledging her part in the whole transfer and deportation of children from Mariupol and I believe from other areas in Ukraine.
Is it surprising that they've actually concentrated on children rather than other perhaps affronts to the ICC's sensibilities?
You know, I have no doubt this is the first of other indictments that are going to come out. Other very serious war crimes, it seems to me, have been committed. And I'm sure this will be the first of a number of cases that will be brought against President Putin and other leaders of the Russian Federation.
I'm just sort of looking at the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, who says the ICC's decisions carry no meaning for our country, including from the legal point of view. Russia is not a signatory, and Russia is not cooperating with this agency, and possible arrest recipes emanating from it will be legally negligible for us. In the terms of the future, what do you think the next tranche of charges could be?
Well, certainly there are other serious war crimes, attacks against civilians, not taking care to protect civilians, even in the face of going against military targets. These are very serious war crimes, and of course the many members of the United Nations are looking at setting up a special tribunal to be able to try President Putin with a crime of aggression.
And just, truly, do you feel that he is ever going to appear before a court?
Well, who knows? When the indictment was issued against Karadzic and later President Milosevic, the attitude of many observers around the world was, well, they will never face justice. Milosevic was very dismissive of the arrest warrant. The last thing he thought would be that he would be kicked out of power and bundled onto an aeroplane and sent to stand at trial in The Hague. So who knows? Who knows how long President Putin will be the leader of the Russian Federation, and what would happen in the face of a new government there.
Thank you very much for your time. That is Richard Goldstone, a former judge who was Chief Prosecutor of the United Nations International Criminal Tribunals. The time now is 5:15, and here's Chris with the headlines.
BBC News understands that junior doctors' representatives in England will meet ministers next week for preliminary talks about their pay dispute. NHS England says the strike by doctors earlier this week led to more than 175,000 patient appointments and procedures being cancelled. The share price in Credit Suisse has fallen by more than 10%, and stock markets have slipped despite attempts to calm fears of a crisis in the banking sector.
Chris, thank you very much. So are we set for a summer of strikes? The budget saw the biggest day of industrial action in decades, with teachers, junior doctors, university lecturers, civil servants, BBC regional journalists and London Underground drivers all downing tools. Now, previously, February held that record with walkouts by teachers, university staff, train drivers, civil servants, bus drivers and security guards. An offer to NHS unions yesterday appears to set the scene for some possible resolution in other disputes, with teachers in for talks today, junior doctors called in for next week. But do settlements create a precedent for other unions? Zoe Conway is our employment correspondent. Can we start with one that certainly does seem to be on the horizon, and that is the passport office workers who could go on strike for 5 weeks, we're told, from the 3rd of May.
At the moment, this looks like it could be very disruptive. 1,900 people in this country, their job is to examine people's passport applications. 1,500 of them are members of the PCS Civil Service Union. So if those 1,500 go on strike, you can see that trying to get people's passports processed could be severely affected. I should add, by the way, that 200 of that 1,500 I'm talking about joined the union today, so it could go up even more. And forgive the basic maths, but that means that 80% of that bit of the passport office workforce could walk out. Now, how disruptive is this? The union will say these are specialist teams, they're not easy to replace. It's not going to be easy for the government to move other civil servants across. The other point they make is that what the government often does is reaches into HMRC, apparently, that's one of the departments they go to, and shuffle some people over. The problem is, says the union, is that HMRC staff are now also part of this industrial action, and so they could choose not to help and also walk out. But the Home Office are saying that they're working on a comprehensive contingency plan, and what they're telling people is to expect that at the moment there's no change to the guidance that it could take up to 10 weeks to get your passport processed. That's the kind of current wait time at the moment, and they're saying at the moment that doesn't change. We're going to be discussing this a bit further, but I just wonder whether the government's got in its mind this kind of beauty pageant of solving industrial disputes. You know, that people care about teachers, they care about nurses, but as you get further down the chain, ask them, do you care about HMRC workers? And the sympathy tends to dwindle. So they will deal with these issues, but the others will just be left to stew. What do you think of that? Well, there's certainly some logic to that argument, because if you look at public opinion polling, it's very high, the support for ambulance workers and nurses going on strike, but for civil servants it's much lower. And you could argue that's quite unfair, because actually of all the pay offers, civil servants has been the lowest this financial year, between 2 and 3%, and the union would say a lot of them are on low wages and suffering from poverty pay. There is a logic to, in terms of the sort of political imperative, which ones do you try and fix first? That you go, nurses, ambulance workers, teachers, you're right, when are they going to get round to the civil service dispute? And I think that's part of the union's thinking. I think they've run out of patience. I think they're saying, right, that's it. We're getting our big threat out now. This is really, really going to disrupt people. We're talking about these passport workers going on strike for 6 days a week for 5 weeks. And so I think the union has run out of patience, and they're saying, right, you have to deal with us now. We don't want to wait any longer. I think that's part of the thinking.
Well, let's get into that thinking a bit more now. Zoe Conway, thank you very much. Paul Nowak is the General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, and I asked him whether the agreement struck with the health unions and the growing momentum in talks with the teaching union was a victory for industrial action.
What is very clear is if the members hadn't voted for industrial action, took industrial action, there wouldn't be new offers on the table. The government wouldn't have even been prepared to sit round the negotiating table. I suppose what's frustrating is we could have been in this position weeks and months ago. I mean, the unions have been asking now for months for the government to sit down and talk seriously about pay. Unfortunately, it's taken members taking action to actually bring them to the table.
Yeah, I mean, what about those who say actually it's a masterstroke to string this out? Because, way back at the beginning, nurses were asking for 19%. Stringing it out and linking to inflation when inflation is falling was actually a masterstroke.
Well, I don't think it'll seem like a masterstroke to those people who missed appointments or who were inconvenienced by the industrial action, or indeed the workers themselves who lost pay. And if this is government playing games with industrial relations, I think it's a really divisive and unnecessary tactic. I mean, the key thing in any dispute is for both parties to sit down and try and reach agreement. And as I say, there's no reason why governments couldn't have sat down months ago. It's really also important that the government now takes these lessons forward and sits down with other groups of workers. We've still got hundreds of thousands of civil servants who were offered 2% for their pay offer this year. Really important the government sits down and reach agreements with those as well.
Often when you look at the sentiment of the public, if it were a beauty pageant, nurses and teachers beloved and cared about, and you sort of travel down that list, and civil servants come a lot lower. Do you think that is a deliberate divide and rule strategy that's going on with the government?
Well, this is familiar from government. They love to drive wedges between different groups of working people, between the public sector and the private sector, between different groups of public sector workers. I actually don't think that will wash with the public, because at the end of the day, the public know the people who work in our passport offices, our job centres, who provide really vital services. They're our friends, our family, our neighbours, and so sort of attempts to drive wedges between different groups of workers or pick one group of workers off against another, I think ultimately will be unsuccessful. And I think what we really need now is a mature approach from government. Let's get the civil service unions around the table and let's deliver a fair deal on pay for those hundreds of thousands of civil servants. We've seen agreements reached in the fire service in Wales and Scotland. Members are now obviously considering the offer in health. Really, we needn't be here, but it's important the government steps up to the plate, negotiates a fair deal.
On the passport workers, I mean, that's 5 weeks of industrial action that is being threatened. How can those people who are working for the passport service actually afford not to work for 5 weeks?
That will be targeted action. Their union will be providing them some financial support during that period. But the key thing is the government could put an end to that strike and the other strikes in the civil service if they were prepared to sit down and negotiate seriously on pay.
No, I mean, then you're suggesting that this has really been a benchmark, and that if unions look at what is going on with health and what is going on with education, they're going to say, well, if it works for them, it'll work for us. And we are absolutely facing a summer of industrial action.
Well, I think that's the last thing that any union member wants, because at the end of the day, people do lose pay as a result of taking industrial action. I'd take a different lesson, to be honest with you. The lesson I would draw is that you can resolve disputes if you're prepared to sit down and negotiate seriously on pay. Now, as I say, the government could have done this months ago. It's not too late, though, to reach a fair agreement. And the best thing for everybody, for public service workers, for the people who rely on their services, and indeed for governments, is to reach a fair resolution on pay.
Your reactions to the budget, I mean, do you think you've got people who you can work with here?
The budget was completely underwhelming when we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis. The Chancellor told us this was a budget to create a high-wage, high-skill economy. There was nothing in there about wages. There was nothing in there about investments in public services or public sector pay. And there was nothing about improving the quality of work. So for me, this was a budget that was long on rhetoric, short on delivery. And it's really a budget that wasn't ambitious enough for Britain and for the British people.
As the General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, do you worry that the stretching into the future of the threat of industrial action from all quarters is actually going to make people very unsympathetic to the concept of union action?
No, I think completely the opposite, to be honest with you, because I think what people will have seen is a government that months ago was saying that there's no more money available for public sector pay. Now, it's taken really difficult decisions by union members to take industrial action, to vote for industrial action, but as a result of that, the government's been forced to the negotiating table. And I think there'll be workers across the public and private sector that will see the difference that unions are making, will see that unions are supporting their members through the cost of living crisis, and hopefully they'll join unions and get active as well.
That's Paul Nowak of the TUC speaking to me a little bit earlier. Jacqueline Gold, the boss of the lingerie retailer Ann Summers, has died at the age of 62. Now, according to her family, she was battling breast cancer for some 7 years, and her death comes just 2 months after that of her father, David Gold, joint chairman of West Ham United. This is Jacqueline Gold speaking to my colleague Lauren Laverne on Desert Island Discs in November 2018 about a party she went to in the 1980s that changed the course of her career.
What was interesting was that women at the party, there was about 12 women at this party, saying to me, "Where do you work then?" I said, "Well, I'm just doing work experience at the moment, Ann Summers, got no intention of staying." It's really very male-dominated environment. And these women were saying to me, "We want to be able to buy sexy underwear. We don't want to wear all that harsh lace stuff. We want to buy nice, sexy underwear that makes us feel good about ourselves. And we want to spice up our sex lives, but we don't want our husbands doing it for us." And I just thought, oh my God, there is this amazing opportunity here, and I've got to try some of this myself.
And try she did. She joined the business at the age of 19 for work experience. She faced resistance because her father, David Gold, was the owner. By the time she was 21, she'd persuaded the largely sceptical all-male board to invest in her radical idea to reinvent the Ann Summers brand by selling lingerie and sex toys at women-only parties held in their homes. Kirsty Walk lived in a house with Jacqueline, and they made the programme Womanhood for BBC Two, exploring some of the biggest issues facing women today.
Women unite! Women unite! Women are demanding to be heard. So I've brought 6 of us together in Leeds.
Oh, hi!
Including one of Britain's richest businesswomen.
Really, all I wanted to do was empower women in the bedroom.
And Kirsty joins us now. You lived with her, you were up close and personal when you made Womanhood. I mean, what was she like?
Well, first, it is an incredibly sad day for our family, and obviously condolences to them and also to the army of women who Jacqueline did empower, and who, it was a kind of revolutionary Tupperware party, and she had that vision to make it put women in control, and she did it so brilliantly. And we got to know each other over the 2-week period that a number of us, including Susie Ruffle, the comedian, Shirley Ballas, Anita, Jadira, were living in this house together, trying to interrogate a lot of the issues that were facing women at the beginning of the 21st century. It was during the pandemic. It was very intense, but she was honestly, I think, one of the most gentle, most modest women I've ever met. And yet, she had the business brain to beat all other female business brains. And even when we were talking a lot about this, she always really bemoaned the fact that there were so few other women serial entrepreneurs, women that had really made it. And she was such a great mentor. And she did as much as she could to bring women forward and empower them. I mean, she was an extraordinary figure who was incredibly self-effacing.
I mean, this was such a long time ago. People may not remember what the high streets used to be like before Ann Summers. How did her reinvention of Ann Summers change things?
I mean, you heard her talking to Laura Laverne there. I mean, she used to talk around the table about how horrific it was. She would go in as this intern to her father's business. And it was essentially quite sleazy. It just felt sleazy. It was like guys kind of, what guys wanted, not what women wanted at all. And she had the guts. I mean, she was so young, she had the guts to say, I'm going to change this. And what was so interesting about, she didn't particularly like labels, but she was a feminist. She was absolutely a feminist, and she knew exactly what she wanted to do, and she knew exactly how to take on patronising men, be it in trade associations or be it on television programmes. She had a really razor-sharp mind, and she made sure that she put it to great effect.
Yeah, and this idea of being a mentor to women, she set up this WOW incentive. I mean, how important was that to actually, send the ladder down?
It was incredible. She talked a lot about that. She was very, very well aware that there were a lot of women that were struggling, and she sent that ladder down. She would be very quietly incredibly generous to women. And I mean, she was the 16th richest woman in Britain. She would walk down the high street. She wouldn't care. She would go into cafes. She talked on the programme. I mean, we went out for a night in Leeds, all of us. We had a few drinks, but we were there to see what young women in Leeds wanted, and we were all really taken aback by how much such intelligent, brilliant young women who were not even in their late 20s were using plastic surgery because of their lack of confidence. And that really took her back and upset us all, but particularly upset Jacqueline. She just thought it was such a terrible indictment of society that these women who had brilliant jobs either in schools and health service or whatever did not feel validated until they had created a different image of themselves, and on a Friday night they got 1,000 likes on Instagram. And she was very thoughtful. She was very thoughtful about her own daughter, about how that affected her and what kind of life she was going to have growing up. No, she was just an